This ancient place, the Caucasus Mountains, is tens of thousands of years old. It has witnessed everything. Its fascinating beauty, its proud and indomitable crests have always been a symbol of pride for its people. But the waves of mischief and cunning and the seeds of discord separated the families that have been happily living together through the centuries. The communal grave that was discovered in Guba in Azerbaijan in the spring of 2007 seemed to help the world to understand the truth and shed a light on the memories of the Azerbaijani youth. In the morning hours on May the 1st, 1918, a punitive detachment entered Guba on Shahumyan's orders. The leader of the detachment was a member of the Dashnak Sutyun Hamazasp, and his helper was Nikolai. They murdered every man, woman and child who came across, entered the houses and killed entire families. They cut the babies and the arms of mothers with knives. Who was Hamazasp? Who were the soldiers of that detachment? They were a part of the Armenian military detachment that fought against the Turkish in Anatolia with the Russian army. They were the assassins hired by Shahumyan with the money from Baku oil, and the assassins that robbed the weapons of the retreating Russian army. And their commissar was the infamous Anastas Mikoyan, who used to fight against the Turkish in Van in Armenian Andronik's detachment, and who held high government posts during the Soviet Union. As it seems, the history of this murderous tragedy is a reflection of the past. According to the agreement between Russia and Iran, signed on September 23, 1723, Gilan, Mazandaran, and Astarabad province and the cities of Baku and Derbent would be under Russian governance. On November the 10th, Pyotr I signed an order on freeing the lands for Armenians migrating from those lands. The essence of the order was to show mercy and keep the Armenians under patronage for the sake of Christianity. On June the 3rd, 1799, Tsar Pavel I signed an order on not depriving the Armenian kings and the Armenians in their obedience of settling in the territory called Kazakh. Like all the other treaties signed during that period of time, the Turkmenchai Treaty, signed on February the 10th, 1828, showed special care towards the Christian Armenians. On March the 30th of the same year, Tsar Nikolai I signed an order on naming the captivated territories as Armenian settlements. With that very order, the ancient Azerbaijani lands of Nakhchivan, Yerevan, and Karabakh became the victims of Armenian claims.
В 1770 году Иран и Турция уже понимали, что без...
Even in 1770, Russia and Turkey understood that it would be difficult to face the great Russian Empire without the buffer state, Georgia.
Поэтому и Иран, и Турция договорились, как бы создать новое это государство.
That is why they were holding negotiations with Georgia to create that country. At the same time, the Armenian kings understood that if the desired strong state is created, they will have to leave the Caucasus.
Если этот вариант образования нового сильного государства на Кавказе получится у Ирана и Турции, то места армянам уже на Кавказе не будет.
Güney Qafqazda ermənilərin artıb törəməsi bilavasitə Rusiyanın İranla, sonra isə Türkiyə ilə apardıqları müharibələr nəticəsində
The number of Armenians in the South Caucasus increased because of the migration as a result of the wars Russia had with Iran and Turkey. The main reason for the migration was to build a barrier between the Muslim countries and the Russian Christians. And for that very reason, they rather skillfully used the Armenians who were all ready for it.
Bu iş üçün həmişə hazır olan ermənilərdən çox məharətlə istifadə elədilər.
The Armenian historians have confused the entire world with their false and invented history. And the truth is that the Armenians wanted to build their country on the territories of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. The most curious point is that the interests of the Armenian nationalists and the Russian Empire were similar. On October the 1st, in order to create a buffering zone along the borders of Iran and Turkey, Russia announced to the Armenian kings and their people that they be under the protection of Tsarist Russia, according to the order of the Tsar, and decided to settle them along the Caucasian line. In 1829, only 160,000 rubles and 400 gold manta was spent from the treasury to help 8,249 Christian families to move to provinces of Yerevan, Nakhchivan and Karabakh. The death of the Russian writer ambassador Griboyedov was also a game that was set for the migration of Armenians. According to the writings of the Russian historian Ivanova, the two young wives of Armenian origin of Fatali Shah were kidnapped with the help of the Shah's eunuchs of Armenian origins from Shiraz and were hid in the Russian embassy. Furious about the case, the religious men attacked the embassy and killed Griboyedov. The state of Iran sends the biggest diamond in the world to Russia as blood money.
İrdelemek istediğimiz tarih sadece 250 senelik bir tarihtir. Bu tarihe baktığımız zaman
the period of history that we want to research is only a period of 250 years. Why is it 250 years that we've had problems with Armenians? When we think about it, we see that until then the Ottoman Empire had given the entire trade sector to Armenians. As part of the army, it was also given to the Armenians, but nonetheless, not the Armenians in the army, but the merchant Armenians were influenced from outside and started staying at a distance from us.
Etkisinde kalarak bizimle mesafe koymaya başlamışlardır.
From the very old times, according to the framework arising from Islamic rule, the Armenians who replaced the Muslim merchants in Christian countries tried to find supporters in Europe. Armenian Hoja Zakar Zahadov, who was engaged in selling Iranian silk in Russia, made a gift to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. It was the diamond throne, which is now kept in the Chamber of Arms and was made in Eastern style of ivory, gold and silver. What was the purpose of such an expensive gift? They had the target of expanding Armenian trade in those countries and to gain authority in the Christian world.
When the Russians took over Turkish territories, especially in Yerevan, in that area, the Russians forced many of the Turks out of that area. In the old days, before the Russians invaded, this was a Turkish area. Majority were Turkish population. But they forced them out and they welcomed the Armenians to come both from Iran and from the Ottoman Empire. They gave them tax breaks, they gave them the houses that had been the Turks' houses. They cooperated with them in every way. And because of that, they created what we call an exchange of populations. In other words, the Armenian population went from Iran and from the Ottoman Empire to Yerevan and other areas in the southern Caucasus, and the Turkish population was forced out, and most of them came to the Ottoman Empire.
После переселения армян из персидского государства,
after the migration of Armenians to southern Caucasus, Nakhchivan and Karabakh from the territories of Iran, several Armenian settlements were created. The Armenians had not been living there since 1845.
То есть с 1045 года на этой территории армяне практически не жили, они не существовали на этой территории.
The Russian Empire hoped to establish an Armenian state by settling the Armenians in the historic territories of Azerbaijan and Georgia. Indeed, it was such a bomb that we still see it gradually exploding.
Действительно, это была бомба, которая взорвалась и взрывается постепенно на наших глазах сегодня. Проблема политические, которые сегодня являются.
We could say that the migrated Armenians fully settled towards the end of the 19th century. The target of Russia was to benefit from those Armenians against Turkey. In 1877, before the Ottoman-Russia War, a large Christian buffering zone was set up along the Turkish border. Russia, that considered itself the heir to the Byzantine Empire, had set the target of the Caucasus, as well as the warm seas. They were building bases and railroads for defense. The policy of the Russian Empire had already strengthened in the Caucasus, they were preparing a scenario of occupying the Straits. Europe was aware of this purpose of Russia. Understanding the risks of those operations, Russia was trying not to irritate its neighbours and was negotiating with them. At that moment, the Armenians who had been moved to the Caucasus 50 years before appeared to be rather useful. The Armenians who had positions in the Russian army and amongst the officials had many relatives in the territories of Turkey, even if they were scattered all over the country. One should also add up the Greeks and the heads of some Kurd families who were won over by the Russians. They were preparing a plan of exploding the Ottomans from inside by using these. The European countries that were aware of this plan were also trying to use the existing powers. The main principles of that policy still remain the same, and the Hinjak, Dashnak committees, the Ramgavur society that serve the interests of different countries at the moment used to engage in sabotage in Turkey. Even if those organizations had different profiles, they shared the same purposes. And the Armenian Church was the power that directed all those organizations who would have done anything to build an Armenian state. In 1877, when the Ottoman-Russian War recommenced, the Armenians managed to inform the Tsar about their wishes through Patrick Nurses. In 1876, Patrick Nurses had met with the English ambassador Sir Eliot in Istanbul. As a result of that meeting, the ambassador wrote in the telegram that he sent back home, "The Armenians are planning rebellions and diversions to attract the attention of the European countries." And Patrick Nurses said hopefully, "If England wants it, Armenia will be built."
Amerika'da yaptığım araştırmalarda da
During my research in America, I read in the books of Armenian writers and academics about how they rebelled and about the ideas of their groups. The Hinchaks and Dashnaks there say that they would kill a lot of innocent Turks, Kurds and Muslims. They would destroy their houses. And as soon as the Muslims get furious and start kicking the Armenians, they would tell the European community about how the barbaric Turkish Muslims murdered Christians. And then Europe would hear their voice.
Onlar da bizim sesimizi duyacak diyor.
The Armenians continued their rebellions from 1890 to 1914 and made tens of thousands of people victims of their diversions. The Erzurum rebellion, the events of Samsun, Kumkapi, Merzifon, Yozgat, Kayseri, and others are good examples of this. The Armenian Ashok Beşiktaşyan was proudly praising the Zeytun rebellion, clearly showing the source of savagery in his lines. The skies and the grounds were roaring that day in Zeytun. The soldiers of the winter were screaming. They say it was an answer from God. The Armenian religion got purified. Thousands of young Turk soldiers, the Cherkess, were seeking the shelter in God. They made the Turk Muslims cry. The Armenian felons were not only planning secret murders in different regions of Turkey, but were also spreading lies and slander shamelessly about how the Armenians living in Turkey were tortured. Europe, that wanted to overcome Turkey, made slogans out of the lie just like today and was pressuring the Ottomans. The felons in charge of the events would be freed and sent abroad, just like at the Istanbul Bank. One of the serious and infamous events committed by the Armenians took place on the 26th of August in 1896 in the historic Ottoman Bank that we see behind us.
Orada patlayan bombalarla insanların kolları, bacakları.
There was a lake of arms, feet, legs and heads of people where the bomb exploded. After the attack on the Ottoman Bank, 700 Armenians and 900 Muslims were killed in Istanbul. But the terrorists who committed the crime fled to Marseille on an English yacht with the help of the English and the French, and they did not let Sultan Abdülhamit punish them there.
Ve cezalandırılmasını da Abdülhamit tarafından önlerler.
Another terror act which is known to be committed by the Armenians is the assassination attempt against Sultan Abdülhamid, who was leaving the Friday prayers on the 21st of April 1905. That is how Abdülhamid remembered the event. When the Armenian committee members dropped the bomb on me, the front of the mosque was all in fire. The legs and arms of the people were flying in the sky. I jumped into the carriage and directed the horses. I went to the palace alone. The Armenian historian Ovanes Kachasnuni wrote, "There were times when we kept the armed men in our houses in Salmas and exploded the Ottoman Bank, organized the assassination of Sultan Abdülhamid in order to attract the attentions of big states. How did that end?" The Dashnaks were propagating the nationalism of Armenians and enmity of the Turks everywhere. The Russians and Armenians and the Armenian religious men sent from the Caucasus were even more stirring up the events. They turned churches and schools into the sources of hatred and loathing, and into a stockpile of weapons. And of course, the tactical moves of the countries, especially Russia, that were writing the scenarios of insidious games and that were thinking about the ideological influence of the crusade, had completely shaken the Armenians that were provided with all the social and legal privileges in Turkey. Well, that was the tragedy of those sorry people.
The Armenians had been living with Muslims, either with the Iran or with the Ottoman Empire, for 700-800 years, and had managed to be reasonably successful. But when the Russians began to invade, the Armenians cooperated, at least many Armenians cooperated with the Russians. This continued up until World War I, after World War I, and in some ways it's still continuing today.
Maevsky, who worked as a counsel in Van and Bitlis, said, "The dirty slanders about Turks should be dropped. It would be better if Europe dealt less with the Eastern Christians, because all the Christians in the Trabzon province are rather satisfied with their places. There are Armenians and the Greek, but no touch of the Europe, the country that is screaming all over the world about the genocide. If that genocide really had taken place, what is your share of guilt? Did you ever think about that?" The Armenians that you call poor and we call loyal had really luxurious lives. What did they lack, really? They had everything for a good life: property, markets, lands, churches, even dignified and luxurious cemeteries. The Armenians never had problems in Turkey with their language or religion or way of thinking. Their social and legal rights were never suppressed and in fact guaranteed. The Armenian writer Mkhritić Tadyan even praised that period of time in one of the newspapers and thanked the Ottoman state. Let's look at the facts one more time. Before the First World War, 19 Armenians worked in the ministries of the Ottoman Empire. There were 30 members of parliament, and 37 had other official posts. Other than that, 20 Armenians were newspaper workers, 11 architects, 140 officials, and 2,000 customs officials. And they all had comfortable lives and work. The architect and the treasurer of the palace were Armenians. Afterwards, they went and became one of the richest families in France. Why couldn't they have stayed? Why couldn't those Armenians just live in Turkey for what they earned in Turkey? They still walk around the genocide monument with those fairy tale days in mind. And they are even trying to convince their babies and telling lies.
Her ülkenin tarih kitaplarına baktığımız zaman görüyoruz ki o ülke için yazılmış tarih kitapları var. Gerçeklerden çoğu zaman kaçınılmıştır.
When we look at the history books of every country, we see that there are history books that are written specially for that country. The truth had often been avoided. That is why we are living through the same tragedies again and again. Why are we facing them? Because me, a Russian person, or even a neighboring Armenian, we were taught completely different histories. Maybe all three of us were taught wrong, but the people die because of that.
Belki üçümüze de yanlış öğretilmiştir. Ama bu yanlışların cezasını dün, bugün, yarın yaşayacak insanlar ödüyorlar.
At the beginning of the 20th century, England, America, France, Russia and Germany had reached a critical point in wanting to expand their authority in the Near East. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 2nd, Turkey and Germany signed an agreement on their union. The Tsar announced the beginning of the war from the balcony of his winter residence in Petersburg. Mobilization was declared in every little place of Russia. The Caucasus always held a special place in the policy of the empire. Baku was under its control. The Armenian millionaires who were once settled there by the Russian Empire and who were always cared about had the authority there. The ethnic outlook of the territory had changed a lot as a result of the infamous policy after the Iran-Turkey wars. The Russian historian Shavrov wrote that 1 million out of the 1,300,000 Armenians living in the South Caucasia were settled there by the Russians. They were supposed to act in the war that was meant to happen between Russia and Turkey. Even in the autumn of 1914, before Turkey could even join the fighting countries, the Armenians were very glad to form detachments of volunteers in the Transcaucasus. The number of Armenians from Egypt, France, America, even from Turkey, who were willing to join the Russian army against the Turks was exceeding all estimates. And it is enough to look at the Armyansky Vestnik magazine to find out the scale of the preparations. In the telegram number 25167, sent from Bulgaria on the 4th of March 1915, the Armenian Varandyan was seeking help from England to send 20,000 volunteers. The Dashnak Sutyun party stated in that document that is still kept in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of England, that Armenians in Kilikia were ready to fight.
The Armenians, the Armenian rebels, cut telegraph lines, they cut communications lines, they made it very difficult for the army. But the main thing that they did was they created a rebellion that took many Ottoman soldiers. For instance, in Van province alone, there were more than 6,000 Ottoman soldiers that had to stay behind and fight the Armenians when they should have been on the front fighting the Russians. Now this meant that in some cases the Ottomans lost. For instance, there is a very important battle fought in Dilman in Iran between the Russian forces and the Ottoman forces.
As it seems, the Armenian factor and an Armenian policy existed throughout the war. The main purpose of this policy was to clean 6 Ottoman provinces of Turks and to build the Greater Armenia instead. The Turkish-Russian War started on the 29th of October. According to the confessions of the head of the Russian army that had a strong defensive position during the battles that continued from the 9th of December 1914 up until the 5th of January 1915, he was aware of all the operations of the 3rd Turkish troops. The Armenians that had already established their squads were engaged in diversions behind the Turkish army. The Armenian volunteer detachments were in the Caucasian army during the Sarigamish battles. There were 4 of them at that moment, and they were rather successful. I will dare to quote General Lieutenant Kalinin, who was the commander of the 1st Caucasian Military Corps. The 3rd detachment was the most successful during the Sarigamish battle on the 19th of October, which ended with our victory. The commander of the brigade, Korosun, wrote about it. The telegraph lines towards the direction of Sarıgamış were destroyed as a result of diversion. The army had lost the connection. That is why the Turkish soldiers had even fired at each other because of the thick fog.
Şimdi Sarıkamış harekatının geçtiği bölgedeyiz.
We are now at the places where the Sarıgamış campaign took place. The Martyrs Alley there is a monument that was built for the memory of 97,000 Turkish martyrs who froze to death on the 26th of December 1914 during the Sarıgamış campaign. The places opposite are the Allahu Akbar mountains. Our soldiers came from right there and moved towards Sarıgamış. The majority of the soldiers managed to come down from the mountains, moved in the direction of Sarıgamış, and was about to win the battle. They destroyed the Russian army and were about to take captives. But some of the Armenian spies had cut the telegraph lines of the Turkish army, and there was no connection between them anymore.
Esir alacaklardır. Ancak Ermenilerden bazı casuslar Türk ordusunun arka hatlarını kesmiş, telgraf hatlarını kesmiş, irtibat kopmuştur.
In 1914, on March the 14th, the Armenian volunteers had occupied Van, even before the Russian army could reach it. In only 2 days, the Muslim population was savagely murdered. According to the writings of the Russian military historian Korsun, the Russian troops under the command of the Russian general Nazarbekov, who was of Armenian origin, were late for 3 or 4 days to enter Van. The purpose was clear. They were letting the Armenian detachments in the city do what they want.
Amerikalı misyonerlerin kitaplarında yayınlamış oldukları Nisan 1915'te
We find in the pictures printed in the books of Armenian missionaries that the Armenian soldiers in Van in 1915 were equipped with modern weapons. Some pictures depict the attack of Armenian soldiers against the Turkish. There are sources.
Şeyler var, belgeler var bunlar.
В них принимали участие не только вот российские подданные, но и турецко подданные армяне.
Not only the Russian Armenians, but also Turkish Armenians had participated there. They were fighting for the future of Armenia. It was supposed to be the Great Armenia. One of the diplomatic officers of the Caucasus governance wrote in 1915, "The Armenian brigades on the Caucasian front were more active. It can be explained by their sense of self-protection and their enmity towards Turks." The Armenian brigades showed an outstanding performance during the May, June and July battles in 1915. The head of the Armenian brigades, Andronik, who was very popular amongst his compatriots, broke the Turkish siege of Van. We have already mentioned that, and cleared the road for our troops to enter the city.
И очистили нашим войскам дорогу к этому городу.
20 Mayıs günü de
On the 20th of May, the Dashnak leader of those times who organized all the rebellions, the infamous Aram Manukyan, was announced the governor of Van. An Armenian state was built in Van under the supervision of the Russians. The English historian Stanford Shaw wrote, "The number of Armenians here before the war was 33,789 people. By the middle of July, about 250,000 Armenians gathered in Van, coming from different directions." The Armenian committees of the city were led by the Armenian felons called Shikhan and Aram, who could escape from Russian death penalty. Hundreds of detachments were added to those of the infamous Andronik, Sumbat, Hamazasp, Dron and Keri. Later, Anastas Mikoyan, who had held high posts in the Soviet Union, also joined this group. The Armenians who had occupied the city destroyed the post and telegraph office, administrative buildings, and killed more than 30,000 Turks.
Well, we've recently written a book on the Van rebellion of the Armenians, and we have been working very hard on that. I have a team, a research team, and we have found many new documents on the Armenian rebellion in 1914 and 1915. And in that context, we have not written much on Azerbaijan, I'm afraid, mostly on the Ottoman Empire. We've found definite cooperation with the Russians. We found that the Armenian rebellion began not in 1915, but in 1914, began in the Van area. and that in Van, many of the Armenian leaders went to the Caucasus, went to the southern Caucasus, to Armenia, to Tiflis, and there they met with the Russians. They received what today would be $15 million. And much of this money was probably used to buy guns and to organize.
In 1915, there were about 50 fanatic detachments in the Russian army. They had only one target standing before them: cleaning Anatolia of Turks, providing the majority of Armenians in those territories, and to build their own state. The confession of the prime minister of the Dashnak Armenian state, Avanes Khachasnuni, is a historical fact. The winter of 1914 was probably the blooming period of my dreams. We were counting on Russia. We were supposed to build our autonomy in the divided Turkish provinces and in the Caucasus, but enmity with the Turkish was too costly for us. And we could not understand as a political party that our issue was not interesting for the Russians. They could walk on our bodies any time. Why did the Armenians devastate the cities that they claimed to be theirs? If Armenians lived in those cities, why would they destroy them? The Armenians and Russians who wrote their names on the Mama Khatun mausoleum, that was the memory of 1706, and would then talk about the Armenian tragedy and their brothers in religion, would pity them. The population of these devastated cities was murdered. Some of them fled to the mountains and stayed there until the end of the war. This issue is still mysterious to us. On the archival footage of Russia, we found the shots of devastated Turkish cities and Turkish refugees after World War I. But we did not see even one Armenian refugee or one destroyed Armenian house. Had there been any, surely the Russian cameraman would have filmed them. Russia had even filmed the Turkish military captives kept in the Nargin island near Baku and showed the world that they were a humanist country. Nevertheless, nobody knows that the wounded Turkish captives were killed and burned within pretext of a spreading infection. The northern part of the island still abounds with human bones. The next attack of the Russians was on Erzurum. The Russian attack on Erzurum that started on the 29th of January 1916 finished on the 3rd of April of that year. The first part consisted of 5 detachments and was commanded by Ter Nikogozov. The city was reduced to ruins in only 3 days. Erzurum was famous with its gold and silver back then, and the city was fully left in the hands of Armenians. Literally every house was on fire. The commanders of the Russian army could not stop the bloodthirsty Armenian soldiers. Whenever we look at Anatolia on the Russian archival footage of the First World War, one cannot help but think of Karabakh. The style is the same. Destroy everything and then call the Turks savages.
Erzurum Türk soykırımı yaşandı bir şeyiz.
Erzurum is another city of genocide by Armenians. As a result of our studies, just as the Azerbaijanis were killed in their own villages, own houses in Karabakh, Latchin, Shusha, Artam and Khojaly, the people from Erzurum and other cities of East and South Anatolia were also killed like that in 1918 by the Dashnak and Hinjaks, Rangavur and other Armenian groups. Starting from January, February, March, The Turkish people were intensely fired until the 12th of May. They claimed the lives of 10,000 people, 9,553. Our martyrs were buried in the 100th park back then. There are different cemeteries like that in different parts of Erzurum. Trabzon is one of the most important strategic ports of the Black Sea. Throughout centuries, the Turkish, the Greek and the Armenians had had friendly and pleasant lives together. But starting from the 19th century, the missionaries coming to Anatolia started grouping. They had their main principles in their program: to influence the beliefs of the Armenians and to create enmity and hatred against the Turks. Thus, there were wide opportunities for military operations on land and sea from Hopar to Trabzon in the beginning of 1916. The Russian and Armenian armed forces had to face great pressure of the Turkish army during the battles for the city of Of. Later, though, they managed to benefit from their brothers in religion. The Russian Marine forces entered Rize from the shores that we see and started cannon fires from 7 o'clock in the morning till 5 in the evening of February the 7th, and the Russian land forces managed to enter the city towards the evening.
Babam dedi, 14 yaşındaydım.
My dad told me I was only 14. They said that the Russian ships were coming. I got interested and ran to look at the ships. I saw them under this minaret in the middle of the sea. They shot 33 cannons, but nobody was wounded in this minaret.
Minareye 33 tane top atıldı. Fakat hiçbiri isabet almamış bu minareye.
The land forces came to the city of Rize in the morning hours on the 7th of April. The local Christian population was widely supporting these operations. The film chronicles that were shot at the period also confirmed this.
Rahmetli anam yeni gelindi o zamanlar.
My mum was a new bride back then.
Dedi ki biz köye kaçtık.
She said we had to run to the village to escape, but the soldiers did not let us go there as well.
Her zaman rahat gel orada da demedi.
The young women were very scared because the Armenian soldiers raped them.
Çünkü Ermeni askerleri kadınlara saldırıyordu.
After the Rize city was occupied by the Russian army in April 1916, the Trabzon operation was prepared under the commandment of General Lyakov. The Russian Marine forces in the Black Sea were prepared and explorative flights above the city began. As it was with Van, Trabzon as well surrendered without a battle. The army that was led by Lyakov was greeted pleasantly by the Christians and entered the city from the Erzurum street without any obstacles.
Karşıda gördüğümüz binaların da yer aldığı, kuşkusuz o dönemde burası.
This is the place where they entered the city.
Sonradan yıkıldı. Bu caddeden gelip girmişler. Rus ordusunu burada.
The Metropolitan Dog Chrysanthos and the Armenians met the Russian army without the consent of the governor who had already left Trabzon.
Diğer Ermeni ve diğer yetkililer karşıladılar. Burada karşıladılar.
Lyakov was appreciated by the religious officials. The possessions of the Turks were literally robbed before the very eyes of the councils that would time and time again announce to the world the so-called savage tortures of the Armenians by the Turks.
Trabzon'daki kütüphaneleri yağmaladılar.
They destroyed the libraries in Trabzon. They chose the 444 manuscripts that were only 100 years old from the library, and yes, they are still kept in Hermitage in St. Petersburg. About 1 million people had to migrate because of the Russian occupation. The people left their houses, gardens, possessions, and their province, and were forced to move to the west.
Büyüklerini bırakıp kenti terk edip batıya doğru göç etmek zorunda kalmışlardır.
The American consul, who took pictures with complacent Armenian children, did not even notice those poor people anxiously leaving Trabzon. Not noticing the tragedies of others and having double standards in the events of the world for the sake of political and religious interests, unfortunately still continues around the world. The Tsar, who paid great importance to the Caucasus front, sent Prince Alexei Alexandrovich to the Caucasus. The great Prince Alexei Alexandrovich wanted to demonstrate Christian fanaticism by visiting a church in Kars that had nothing to do with Armenians. Khachasnuni estimated the political scene of that period as follows. Russians tricked and betrayed us. The Russians started leading a policy of emptying Armenia and settling Kazakhs there. According to the information of the Tbilisi Mobilization Office, that policy could not satisfy the Armenians, who had the population of only 121,321 people in the Caucasian front. The Russian Armenians were called for mobilization in 1914. Only 300,000 Armenians were called. Most of them fought on the Caucasian front. The Armenian generals who served in the Russian army addressed the Supreme Head Commander with a proposal of creating a separate Armenian army, but the Ministry of Defense did not agree. The ceremony of greeting the Prince Alexei Alexandrovich in Erzurum with bread and salt was for the sake of showing the Armenian majority in those territories and thanking the Russians who rescued them. Bayburt, the land of Dede Gorgut, who lived in the 6th century, was another Turkish city that had witnessed the Armenian savagery. Look, here is a letter sent by a nurse working in the hospital where the great prince gave the honor of visiting after the city was occupied in 1916.
The scene that I saw in Bayburt when I came there on the 8th of August 1917 was horrible. The Armenians under the Russian command were savagely torturing the Turkish in Bayburt. Arshak and Andronik were personally killing all the children in the hospital where I used to work. The children that they took along while leaving Bayburt were killed along the way.
Asıl ana mekan o aşağıdaki daha önce gördüğümüz taş mağazalarda.
This was a real battlefield. 48 people hid in that stone cave.
Kurtulanlar var. Yaklaşık bir 48 kişi de sonradan burada bir yanlış cephanelik ateşlediği için o günkü işte Ermeniler.
The Armenians started crying that the Turks were coming. Those 48 people got tricked and left the cave to save other people from burning houses. All of them were then killed.
Halkı kurtarmaya çalışıyorlar.
I was also there. We were 3 brothers. We were told that we will be given flour and grain. We all went. But when I saw that they filled people into carriages and burnt them down, we ran away. I had 4 or 5 uncles. They were all killed. They did not pity their wives, the old, or the children. They killed them all.
Bir tane koymadılar. Ne karısını, ne erkeğini, ne dişisini.
Hepsini öldürdü.
Hepsini öldürdü.
There was a man called Andronik and one Arshak.
Arşak Paşa. Paşaydı.
He was the head of those unions. Who gave the order to Bayburt?
Emri o vermiş Bayburt'ta.
Katliam
Yes, you got it right. Bless you. Arshak Pasha. He was the Pasha of the Armenians.
Arşak Paşa'ydı paşa. Ermenilerin paşası.
These poor people, who were more than 100 years old, still remember those times with fear and pain. On the 25th of October 1917, the Bolsheviks took over the power in Russia. On the 16th of December, the Russian National Soviet of Commissars appointed Shaumyan, who was first a Dashnak and then turned to be a Bolshevik, the Commissar Extraordinary of the Caucasus. He immediately called the Armenian troops that had retreated back to Baku and sent the bloodthirsty Andronik and Dr. Zavriev to Erzurum on behalf of the Zakavkazia Commissariat. The Armenian savagery reached unbelievable peaks after that. In December 1917, the Russian army in the Caucasus started leaving the front. A peace agreement was signed on the 18th of December in Erzincan. After this agreement, the Russian army started leaving the occupied lands. Nevertheless, along the road, they would savagely kill the Muslim population and destroy entire villages. Back then, the newspapers published in Tbilisi wrote that the demobilized Russian armies had become a gang of cannibals who were reducing every place from Sargamish to Gümrü that they passed through into ruins. The Armenian armed detachments replaced the Russian army that retreated. The refugee Greeks were informing that the Armenian detachments and armed deserters that were running from the Turkish troops were completely destroying all the Muslim villages along the way, were setting everything on fire and literally cutting people's throats. 82 villages were completely ruined. The Kars province turned into a huge cemetery because of the revolts of Kapitan Mofesyan and General Areshov, and Igdir, Khoy, Nakhchivan, Zangezur and Karabakh was not any better because of Andronik's detachments. In 1918, Baku turned into the political battlefield of the hegemonic countries. The political groups such as the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Cadets and Dashnaks were all serving the interests of countries that they were fighting for the oil of Baku. Those parties were functioning under the orders of the Armenian Shaumyan and Sarkyan.
Mart hadisələri ərəfəsində Bakıda çox minlik erməni əskərləri də olmuşdu.
A lot of Armenian soldiers had come to Baku on the eve of March events. Because Russia had left the First World War and the Caucasian Front was destroyed, the armed Armenian soldiers entered the territories along the Zakavkazia Railroad.
Erməni əskərləri 50 silahlı Zakavkazia dəmir yolu boyunca ərazilərə tökülmüşlər və onların neçə minlik ordusu Bakıya doluşmuşdu.
Their numbers in Baku at that time was exceeding 4,000 people, and there were about 6,000 among the army that was under the Baku Soviet. On the eve of the March events, the city was living through the imminent fear and danger of a tragedy that was going to appear on the grounds of nationalism. Baku was reminding of a gunpowder barrel, and only a spark of a pretext was enough to light it.
Barı çəlləyini xatırladırdı ki, onu alıştırmaq üçün bir qığılcım ya bir bəhanə lazım idi.
That massacre that started at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 30th of March 1918 entered the annals of history as one of the most horrible cases of cruelty. Following Saakyan's orders, the Russian ships standing on the Caspian Sea also started firing at the city with cannons. They were told that Russians were being killed in the city, but the Dashnaks were murdering the Baku Muslims.
Bakıda elə bir məhəllə, elə bir küçə, elə bir dalan və tin qalmayıb ki, ermənilər ora hücum eləməsinlər və ağla sığmaz bir qəddarlıqla.
You wouldn't find even one yard, little street, any alley or a corner in Baku where Armenians did not attack and did not murder the Muslim population with inadmissible cruelty and mercilessness, where they wouldn't burn the houses and destroy them. Over 12,000 people were killed. all the social buildings of the Muslims, starting with the Ismailiya building, the buildings of Kaspi and Open Word newspapers, up to their houses, schools, mosques and markets were burned and completely ruined. Other than that, according to the last estimations, only the damage caused to the property of the Muslims reaches a number of over 400 million rubles.
Zərər ən aşağı hesablamalara görə 400 milyondan artıq bir rəqəmə çatmışdır.
The Muslims who could escape the murders were fleeing to the surrounding villages and mountains. That mass murder was called as if it were Bolshevik-Musavat political conflict. Shaumyan even told Moscow that it was civil war. The Armenian bishop Barat sent false information to the American General Harbord and said that Armenians had not participated in those events. But in fact, those were the Armenians volunteers who fought together with the Russians against Turks in the Caucasus War, and they were the ones committing those crimes on Shaumyan's orders. The truth, as the Armenian historian Ovanes Kachasnuni confessed it to be. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks destroyed the Musavat in Baku with our help.
Hadisələrin gedişi göstərdi ki, mart hadisələrinin, mart qırğınlarının
The events show that the main purpose of the March murders was to really destroy physically all the Muslims of Baku, to own their properties and to strengthen the position of the Bolshevik Armenian forces in Baku.
Bolşevik erməni qüvvələrinin Bakı şəhərində öz mövqelərini möhkəmlətməsi olmuşdu.
There was complete chaos in Baku. The interests of the empire were colliding to get the Azerbaijani oil. The English, the Russians, and the Americans were trying to gain authority here. The oil from the wells that was literally hitting like fountains was floated into the sea because it couldn't be transported. The historical facts prove that 4 million tons of oil was dispensed into the sea during that period of time. The head of the commune, Shaumyan, was trying to realize his plan of destroying the Azerbaijanis as a nation and was committing mass murders in Baku and then Shamakh, Salyan, Goychay, Neftchala and Guba. And the perpetrators were the detachments led by Andronik, Hamazasp, Haik, Dro and felons of that ilk who retreated from the Turkish front. The findings of the Azerbaijani Extraordinary Investigation Commission on this bloodshed and on who had committed it was sent to the Paris Peace Conference, but there was no response. On May the 27th, 1918, the Georgian and Azerbaijani representatives of the Zakavkazia parliament that functioned in Tiflis announced their independences. The Armenian members of the parliament did not accept this proposal. Why? Hadn't they been crying all over the world that they'd been fighting and killing to build their own state? Because they did not have a territory where they would compose the majority of the population. And they never did. The Armenian state was agreed to be established, with Yerevan city being the capital, with the consent of the Azerbaijani members at the meeting of the parliament. A short brief about the history of Yerevan city. From ancient times, history tells us that Turkic tribes lived in those territories and had a state. The elder Armenians who live in that city in fact still remember very well the times when they moved there. The Hais, who always desired the lands of others, moved their religious center from Kilikia to the 3 churches, Echmiadzin, that they had bought from Argoyunlu Yakub Pasha for 525 dinars in 1431 and started appropriating the ancient Arman Christian church and their territories. The dark days of the city began after Yerevan was announced the capital of the Republic of Hayistan. After the establishment of the Soviet government, the Armenians occupied the territories of Azerbaijan inch by inch through all sorts of tricks, deprived the Azeri Turks of the lands of their fathers, ruined the historic monuments and built a new capital. Today, the members of the Armenian parliament know very well that the places where they set their armchairs used to be a children's cemetery. There used to be tens of mosques and religious schools, the palaces of khans and beys, caravansarais, different ancient cemeteries, several other historical monuments under the alleys that they are walking on. The cultural monuments that the people of Azerbaijan were building for centuries were destroyed in no time. 211 Muslim villages were burnt down in the Yerevan province. 80,000 people from Yerevan became refugees. Even during the times of the Soviet Union, the Azeri Turks living in the territories of the Republic of Azerbaijan were forced to leave the lands of their fathers. This time it was fulfilled not by the means of weapons, but according to the unjust orders of the Communist Party. They either had to willingly move to the territories of Azerbaijan or were deported to Central Asia. And so, an Armenian state without Turks was established. The aggressor Armenia captured 20% of Azerbaijani territories right before the eyes of the world and deprived 1 million people of their homes. The Armenians, who never formed a majority anywhere and who never could be able to build their own state, became a real disaster in the 20th century. This nation that was pursuing the interests of the empire and now trying to deceive the world with myths about genocide while trying to conceal the traces of terrible crimes they had once perpetrated. It is enough to look at the communal graves and Muslim cemeteries that give you chills from Anatolia to the Caucasus. You will understand who in fact was the victim of genocide. The traces of the Armenian mutiny in the well-known provinces of Turkey still remain. New tragedies began before the wounds by the Dashnak army even had time to heal. The lands of our fathers became empty. Sometimes it feels like the suggestion of the head of the criminal group Andronik had become the slogan of the Armenians. Destroy everything, clean these territories from Turks. We have the mountains behind us.
Azərbaycanın ərazi bütövlüyü pozulub.
The territorial integrity of Azerbaijan has been violated. As a result of the destructive policy of the Armenians against the Azerbaijanis, over 1 million of our compatriots are living as refugees and internally displaced people, and the territories of Azerbaijan have been completely destroyed. Our mosques, graves and buildings have been ruined. Nobody is responding to this. Nobody punishes Armenia for this, and we are the ones to decide what we should do. We've been trying to continue peace talks for over 13 years now. We are trying to regain our territorial integrity through negotiations. But when we see that they produce no results, we will have to use other methods.
Yes, Karabakh is a bleeding wound for all of us. About 1 million of our compatriots are facing difficult times in their own country because of the occupation. This bitter situation makes our hearts ache, and it is such an obvious injustice that the international organizations cannot turn their backs. Despite the serious peace calls of the Azerbaijani and Turkish heads of state and politicians, the Council of Europe, the European Union, the OSCE and the United Nations haven't been able to take serious steps in the peaceful resolution of the problem. Is it so difficult to show the truth as it is? Not at all. There is no need to struggle to look the truth in the eye. The only necessary thing is the objective, impartial and unbiased approach towards the tragedies of the past 2 centuries, and to follow the voice of conscience.